Hello, I'm Jack Grady, and on behalf of the Archives and History Committee of the First Baptist Church on the Square in LaGrange, Georgia, we welcome military veteran Julian Hurst, and we thank him for his service to our country and to our church. Julian, good morning to you, sir. Thank you for your presence and
thank you, Jack,
for your willingness to do this interview for our archives here in the church. We look forward to hearing more about that in a moment. I know that you were in the Navy. I think you were in the Navy, weren't you?
Right.
Okay. So you're going to tell us a little bit about your experience, but I believe you first are going to mention some of the military experiences of your two brothers who were active in our church some years ago, but are now deceased. So why don't you do that? Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'd like to very much, just to honor them some, because we were very close. We were in business together for some 50 years.
50 years.
And so it was a very close relationship. I would like to mention the fact that, to give you a little bit of background, that we were all born in Camilla, Georgia, which is about 25 miles below Albany. My oldest brother was born in 1927. My next brother in 1929. I was born in 1933. We have a younger sister who was born in 1935. And our father died when I was 11 years old. So my mother was left with a burden, which she handled admirably. I didn't quite say that word
you did.
right.
You got it fine.
But all four of us got a college education.
Oh, boy.
And I don't know how she did it.
Great.
Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. And I would like to mention that my oldest brother entered the Navy right at the end of World War II, probably about the time that you did, 1945.
Yes.
And he had been at college, I think, for most of that year at North Georgia College, and it was time for him to be drafted, and he decided he'd rather be in the Navy than the Army, so he joined the Navy. And what he ended up doing, since the war ended, about the time he got his training, was he was on a troop ship that went over bringing back GIs and whatever from the European theater of the war.
Oh, the European theater.
And he was assigned a job as an assistant to a dentist, I think. They evidently had dentists and all sorts of doctors on those ships bringing back the people that were being brought back from the war zone. And so he had an interesting time with that.
I'm sure, yeah.
So he spent a couple of years in the Navy, I guess. And since he was not alive when we started doing this, I wanted to just mention him.
Good for you.
The fact that he served his country.
Sure.
And he always was the patriarch of our family, because after our father died, he always felt a responsibility for us, even though he was only 18 years old.
His name was
Byron
Hurst.
In fact, he was city councilman here for a number of years.
Well, I've seen the street marker.
Right.
That's that name, Byron Hurst Street. Good. I appreciate you telling us about that.
But I'd also wanted to mention my second brother, who served in the U.S. Army. He went through ROTC at the University of Georgia, and when he finished, he was inducted into the Army, into the infantry, as a second lieutenant.
Took his commission at that
Right, during the Korean War in about 1952.
Yes.
So you know where he was going.
Yes.
He went to Korea.
Yes.
As a platoon leader, about the most dangerous place you could be. He survived, although he was wounded. Fortunately, it was not a life-threatening injury, but he was wounded. And after when he left, he was relieved by a former friend he'd gone to school with, a boy from Griffin. and he got killed.
Is that right?
Doing the same thing my brother was doing. So the Korean War was a very took a lot of lives.
It did. It did.
So
now,
that
his name was
Frank.
Frank. So, okay, Byron was the older.
Right.
Yeah, and then Frank.
Frank.
Okay.
They both are deceased. Frank died when he was 75, and my older brother Byron died when he was 83.
And they were active members of our church here.
Yes, they were.
And they are on our list of people who we would love to have interviewed, but of course cannot. But I appreciate you're doing this because you fill in some of the missing information about them.
Well, I wanted to do that because I felt like they contributed a lot more than I did.
Okay, thank you.
Like I said, we all grew up in Camilla, a small town. We at that time in our school, like a lot of schools in Georgia, we only had 11 grades.
Oh, yes.
We went to 12 grades. My sister's class was the first one that had 12 grades. So when I was a senior in high school, I was only 16 years old. And I really couldn't go to college yet because of money. So I stayed in high school a 12th year. And it just so happened about 5 or 6 guys in our class stayed another year because we'd had a pretty good football team. And we thought if we all stayed, we might win the state championship that next year. So we missed it by 1 game.
Really?
The team that beat us won the state championship. But anyway, that spring of my senior year, we got up a track team. One of the coaches did. We'd never had a track team. And it turned out that was my best sport.
I see.
And I did real well in the high hurdles. In fact, as I won the state championship.
Did you really?
In our division, which was a smaller town.
Okay.
And so I was offered a partial scholarship to Florida State University to be on the track team. Prior to this, both of my brothers had graduated from Georgia. My sister later graduated from Georgia, so I was a black sheep. I went to Florida State. But fortunately, that's where I met my wife.
Okay, that thought ran through my mind as you were thinking about it. Yeah.
I was a senior and she was a freshman, and at a function I met her, and I looked at her and says, I think that's the girl I want to marry.
Amen.
So it worked out, and so the fact that I went to school down there, changed my whole life because that's where I picked my wife. It just so happened that we did get married, and by the way, she was in the Florida State Circus.
The Florida State Circus.
You know, they perform at Callaway Gardens still today.
Still today, right.
So after that, and I guess you want me to continue, don't you?
Oh, please do. Yeah, tell us more about your experience now.
After I graduated from college, I was still subject to the draft, as everybody else was, so I decided that I would apply for OCS in the Navy, which is what I did, and I was accepted, and I went to OCS up in Newport, Rhode Island, got my commission in January of 1956.
Ensign. You were an
ensign in the Navy.
Ensign in the Navy.
I went to a couple of schools after that, and in August of that year, Jane and I got married in Jacksonville, Florida, her home. And I was stationed at Patuxent River, Maryland, for the duration of my active duty. And I was in the Flying Navy. We flew the big 4-engine super constellations that had the radar hump on the top and on the bottom. Yeah. And they were called WV-2s in the Navy, but they were the same airline, same plane the airlines flew, called Lockheed Super Constellation.
Oh boy.
But that was quite an experience, and we kept, we had 12 planes. 2 planes were kept in the Mediterranean all the time with their crews, so we took turns going over about twice a year in the Mediterranean, and for about 6 to 8 weeks a whack.
And what were you doing there?
Flying and naval operations with the 2nd Fleet.
Okay.
We'd have maneuvers in the Mediterranean, over the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea and all.
Yes.
And I was the radar officer or head of the CIC, which is a Combat Information Center, which is very common on ships.
Yes.
And airplanes, it's a little different, but it serves the same purpose. We were up there for airborne early warning for the fleet. So that's what we did. And our detachment, when I first went over, was at Port Leoti, Morocco, which was an Air Force base. And after a while, the Moroccans made us close that base. So we had to go someplace else. So our detachment next went to Malta.
Malta.
On a British base. Wonderful experience. The British were very nice to us. And it's a beautiful place, Malta. You don't think of it as being so beautiful, but it really is. So I had a wonderful time, a wonderful career in the Navy for the 3 years that I was in, because I was fortunate enough to be in during peacetime.
Yes.
And met a lot of wonderful people.
Learned a lot.
Learned a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I learned about different parts of the world, and learned a lot about the Navy, and it was just a wonderful thing, and my wife enjoyed it too.
Well, good.
It was a wonderful thing that we got married and we went off for 2 or 3 years, and it made it a good way to sever ties with your family somewhat to get started out, you know.
Well, yeah, it's a good way to put it. Well, I'm intrigued by this responsibility that you had on the plane. What were you looking for? What were you trying to determine that you needed to report?
Well, mainly other aircraft.
Other aircraft.
That may be attacking the fleet. That was the theory. And the way the system was set up back then, and I'm sure it's similar today, is if you picked up an aircraft on your radar, or a group of aircrafts, you had a little button you could push, or something that you could check their identification. It was a process called IFF, identification friend or foe.
Oh.
And when you activated this device, if it was a friendly aircraft, they would send you back a signal, like a couple of dashes.
Yes.
If it was not, then it was an enemy aircraft, and you reported it as an enemy aircraft.
Yes, and that could determine whether it was enemy or not.
That's right. That was the system back then.
Why?
And we also controlled aircraft from our own fleet, like from carrier aircraft, and we would vector them into the location of these other aircraft if they were possibly enemy aircraft. And of course, he could find out visually when he found them.
Yes.
And like I said, all that we ever did was in the training process, because we never had to use it in combat, because we never were in combat.
Okay. So you were flying up there, surveying the scene, so to speak, and reporting to other military units.
Right. The fleet below.
The fleet?
Usually would have a flagship that we reported to.
Okay.
So it was very interesting.
I'm sure it was. Did you live on the base?
Well, we were stationed at Patuxent River, Maryland, which is it may still be the Naval Air Test Center. And we lived in an area called Officers' Quarters, which were little apartments.
Yes.
It was a nice place and nice people. Nice little town. It was located about the same distance from Washington, D.C. as LaGrange is from Atlanta.
Oh, I see. Okay.
About 60 miles.
Yes. All right.
So it was a nice area to be in back then. Washington was nothing like it is now back then. It was just a big old city, not a huge city.
Yes. Well, so you, as an officer then, you didn't go through what I call boot camp in the Navy, but you had some basic training, I'm sure.
Well, we went through 16 weeks.
16 weeks.
We went in as a seaman recruit.
Okay.
If you didn't make it through OCS, then you just went back in as an enlisted man and as a seaman recruit and do whatever you would do had you not gone to OCS. But we lived in not the same barracks as the rest of the enlisted men. We were in a special section for the officer candidates because we went to classes every day. Now, when we went through the mess hall, they didn't like us too much because they knew we were going to be officers.
Okay.
But some of the best friends I had in my tour of duty at Pax River was enlisted people. I had a lot of good friends that were enlisted people. There was not any real big magic line to separate it.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. Well, good. Well, so it was a different experience to me as one who was in the Navy, a different experience to what I had because of the fact that you were already into officer training and moving in the direction that you did. But it sounds like a very unique experience that you had, though, your assignment to that fleet, airplane fleet, and the work that you did while you were in the Navy. It was unusual, and again, in my own view, difficult for me to visualize some of the duties that took place while you were aboard those planes and what you did.
Well, it was interesting also in that when we were up doing these exercises or maneuvers or whatever, however you want to refer to them, we may be out there for 8 hours, flying back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah.
Very rarely were we up there that long, but they had that capability, but sometimes we were.
I see. Okay. And these planes, were they 4-engine, 2-engine?
Yes, 4-engine aircraft, props, and same planes they flew.
Do you have any experiences while you were flying that were suddenly challenging and dangerous?
Well, only one time we were doing an operation up in Iceland with the fleet, 6th Fleet, and we were.
The 6th Fleet was there in the Iceland area.
Well, now I may have it backwards between the 6th and the 2nd.
That's okay.
But the 6th, as I remember, was in the Atlantic.
Yeah. Okay.
And the 2nd was over in the Mediterranean.
All right. Excuse me for interrupting. Go right ahead.
But you know, I'm doing things from memory that I may not quite remember right.
Okay.
But I'm sure it was the 6th and the 2nd.
Well. Good. Okay.
But Iceland, you know, is a very cold water area.
Yeah.
And we lost a propeller. In other words, we threw a propeller. It came off.
In flight?
In flight.
Yeah. Okay.
So you had 3 more.
Well.
But still, it's frightening.
Kind of a nail-biting incident.
And the pilot was frightened too. And
I bet.
And but we got back okay.
Good.
But you don't want to have to ditch in the North Atlantic.
So. Oh my goodness. Well, you've told us how you moved from introduction to the Navy, but went right on into officer training school, and from there, and very interesting assignments that you had. I appreciate you sharing that. Any other memorable experiences you had besides the throwing of the propeller from the plane? Anything else that stands out in your memory?
In living in the area, actually we weren't on base with where we lived, but it was right outside. It was that area was a small town called Lexington Park. It was probably a third of the size of LaGrange at the most. And but you know, it's a nice area to live, and your social life was very similar to what it would be if you were just in a community working, because you knew the people that you worked with, and it was just a nice period of time for a young married couple like us.
Sure.
because we were around other people in similar conditions, and it was just very pleasant. And it was a good growing experience for us in starting out our marriage.
Yes. Well, let me ask you one other question, Julian. What experience would you say that you had that helped prepare you for your future?
Well, I think meeting people from other areas and working in an organization like the squadron that I was in, and the way it was organized, and the people that were in command, and all of these sort of things that taught you the way it is. And when you get out into real life, you have similar circumstances.
Sure. Okay.
Although when I left, I never had the experience of working with a big company, because my older brother, Byron, who I had referred to earlier, started a business in LaGrange with the help of an uncle. He started a radio station in 1953.
1953, radio.
And so that's when I got out of the Navy. We came back to LaGrange, and that's where I worked along with my middle brother too. So it was radio, WTRP.
Like a family business.
It was.
Yeah.
And so it was.
What was it? What you started to say the call word, call letter?
WTRP.
WCRP.
And it's still out there, but we no longer own it.
Yeah.
But we had 3 families and a small radio station, and it was hard to make a living. So we were fortunate in that we had a strong broadcast association in the state of Georgia, association of all the radio stations and television stations. And we had a director, our director of the association named Jack, I forget his last name, but anyway, Jack was a brilliant man, and he was way ahead of the curve and things that are coming. And it was a new industry coming along back in the 60s called cable television.
Oh, okay.
And so he was promoting that broadcasters get into this industry because it could be another arm of what they were sort of already doing, plus it could be competition.
Yes.
So we were one of the few that listened to him, and we ended up getting into the cable TV business.
Expanded kind of.
Yeah, we sort of operated it out of the radio station in the beginning until it got too big.
I see.
And the fact is, we had a 4th partner that was also involved with WLAG, the other radio station.
Oh, yeah.
And he was a friend, although he was a competitor. So the 4 of us did it. So he was an equal partner with each of us. So we borrowed $25,000 apiece, and I don't know how we got Fulton National Bank in Atlanta to loan it to us, but we did, and we started with $100,000.
The cable TV.
The cable TV, and that was a lot of money then. And we had the franchise in LaGrange, and we built the cable system, and it was a new type industry. Fortunately, we had a cable system in West Point that we were friends with, and we learned a lot from them.
I see. Okay.
But it was quite an endeavor in that it was all a new thing. People did not know much about it, including us.
I see.
So we had to learn as we went along. And I always remember when we got to our first 1,000 customers, we had set that as a goal beyond which we would survive.
Okay.
Less than that, we didn't think we'd survive.
Oh, my.
So we were delighted when we got to that point.
I bet you were. Wow, what an experience that was. That's so. Thinking about looking for programs and projects. You didn't really need the. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is the GI Bill was so helpful to many of us, but you didn't need it because you had already gone through college, right? by that period of time.
That's right. I may have been smarter had I gone into service first and got it, because I had a lot of friends that did. And my comment about the GI Bill, I think it's, I'm not socialist minded, and the GI Bill was a little bit bordering on that. Yeah. But I think it's the best thing this country ever did after World War II. It educated a lot of people.
It surely did.
The fact is, where I went to college was a girls' school up until 1947. Oh. And it was one of the many colleges that were influenced to go co-ed because of the GI Bill and the need for places to put all these people.
I see, yeah. That's interesting. I didn't realize that. Well, Julian, let me ask you one other thing. I know you told us a while ago about your brothers being active in this church. I know you have been for many years. You and your wife, Jane. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've been involved in here in the way of church growth and church outreach and so on.
Well, I'll have to be honest with you. Up until recent years, I was just a warm body.
Well,
I really spent a lot of hours working and neglecting my church for years because.
But you had your membership here, and you.
Yes, and we attended. Yeah, we always came to church, but you know, you need to do more than that. Yeah. So I was not what I'd call the kind of member that you should be, although I was a member. Mm-hmm. And I've always loved this church, and it's always had great leadership. And I hope I have provided some of it in recent years.
I'm sure you have.
I've tried to be involved in things that I might make a contribution.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I hope I will continue to do that as long as I'm able to.
Well, knowing you, I'm sure that you will be in the years ahead.
I'm just honored to be a part of what you're doing to do these interviews for people that have served in the military. Yes. Because I think our military people are quite often overlooked in the scheme of things.
Yes.
And when you think about all of the things you get in the mail today, yes, how much of it is asking for help for our wounded warriors and such.
Right.
They shouldn't have to do that.
No.
That's one thing the government ought to do is look after our people who served in the military and who have suffered.
Yes.
And are still suffering.
Right.
There's no excuse for it.
Yep, we see that all the time.
Yeah.
Evidence of that. Well, you mentioned this project that we have of interviewing our veterans. You will make number 45.
Is that a lucky number?
No. If you wanted to.
Oh, I'd love to be 45 again.
Yeah, well, you and I together, we've interviewed 45 of our veterans. And I really appreciate your participation in this project. It's been a very meaningful experience to me, and I'm sure it has been to you too. I might go ahead and say that the Archives and History Committee of our church is to be commended for pushing this and promoting it and getting us started. And we'll look forward to interviewing a few more until we get as many as we can of this surviving group. We identified, by the way, we have identified 102 people who were members of our church or are members of our church who had service in the military. And now we are getting close to interviewing about half of them, almost half of them. But so many of them are deceased, particularly the World War II group. I'm sorry that we didn't start earlier to get that group in here too. But we're doing the best we can with those we have.
I think you've done a great job. You've been an inspiration to me.
Well, I appreciate your comment, but I'm surprised to hear anybody say that. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to sit and chat about this.
My honor.
Experience. Thank you.
Thank you,
Julian Hurst.